So we're now at the end of technique training, and it's time for another checkpoint to make sure that we're ready to move on to Ascent 1. The transition from technique training through Ascent 1, this period of time is, I would say, the most important transition and the cognitively most difficult transition of the entire course. If we can get this right, everything else starts clicking into place. If we can't get this right, it is a constant struggle every lesson, every stage, and progress is slow and it is grim. This is, I would say, the most important checkpoint that there is to be. The important things up on top of the fundamentals that we need to be achieving by this point is that we need to have very good ability to write notes non-linearly. We need to be very good with our copes. It may not be perfect, but we need to be consistent with our copes, and the copes technique needs to be reasonably accurate. We need to make sure that we have a good process of creating chunks and finding relationships using the process of inquiry. And this is the really important thing. It's a paradigm shift. Before this point, we would normally see information and sensory data as the priority. We're thinking about information. We're thinking about getting information down. And at this point, we need to start changing that so that we realize the most important thing is not the information. The information comes secondary to when we understand the relationships. It's about seeing that it's actually possible to learn information without even trying when we focus on the relationships, and realizing it's possible to learn relationships when we don't even know the information, which seems completely impossible and counterintuitive, but it's just the way that the brain works, automatically filling in lower levels of learning when we put our sights on the higher levels. So what we're doing is we're using the questioning process. We're getting used to asking questions of the information, tapping into our curiosity and engaging ourselves, actively engaging ourselves, and creating a skill around that. And we are using these questions to point our brain in a certain direction. When we ask the question, it forces us to think in a certain way. And we are using that phenomenon to point our brain towards the information in a certain way. And that direction is looking at, where are the relationships? How are these ideas connected together? How can I relate it to what I already know? Through asking these questions and understanding all of these relationships, over time we can see how different concepts, different keywords are related to each other, and therefore how we might be able to group some of them together because of shared functions, similar characteristics, similar reasons for importance, similar processes, whatever it might be. We are able to start grouping ideas together because we are able to appreciate the relationships. And it has to be in that order. We are able to appreciate relationships after going through the process of answering these questions. In doing so, we are able to see how we can group the information, and then we can apply our nonlinear note-taking skills so that we can see how we can bring that together into something that looks relatively nonlinear. And the nonlinear is important because it's pretty much impossible to show relationships to this level of complexity if we don't have a nonlinear method of note-taking that allows us to actually show those relationships without like 600 words per relationship. The copes, again, is one of those things that's incredibly important. Depending on the other issues you have, like procrastination, distractions, scheduling, prioritization, things that we're taught all the way from the very, very beginning of the course that we've continually given you techniques on, this is also the time to say, am I using that? Now, I'm not going to say don't move on if you're not using that, because you may not have it as a problem. But if you do have it as a problem, you get distracted, you procrastinate, then it's also a good time to say, cool, am I using all the techniques that I've learned so far? Go back through the course and just see all the techniques again and just ask yourself, okay, am I using these? Am I using these? Maybe spend a little bit of time, a week or so, trying to implement that into your system, do some copes on that, and get on top of your procrastination or scheduling issues or whatever it might be before you move on. You can keep working on that through the later stages, perfectly fine, but it starts getting a little bit harder to refine the technique starting from here on. I don't think you want that hanging over your head. You want to get the ball rolling on that to a certain level of momentum before you then start tackling the other stages. But, if you're feeling like the ball is rolling, then it's fine to continue refining and improving that through the later stages for sure. Now let's take a look at some of the work, and we'll make a decision about whether, if your work looks like this, you can move on or not. So again, have your work open, compare what you're doing with these exemplars, and we'll go through and make a few decisions here. The first piece of work that we're going to look at here is a compilation of a number of things, and we're going to start by having a look at the Kolb cycle and make a decision about whether we think this Kolb cycle is good enough for the stage. So straight away, there are some positive things that we can see. Number one, it looks fairly long, but then this one is pretty short. I mean, it looks long, but the column is very narrow, so it's actually not very detailed. What's the problem with the reflection not being detailed enough? Well, the problem is that if the reflection is not detailed enough, then we don't have enough data to figure out what the problem is. And so it goes like this. When we do our Kolbs, the experience is just the parameters of what we're thinking about. The reflection is all the information, the data about the experience. By the end of the reflection, we should have all the clues, all the evidence, all the observations and data that we need to start being able to see why we are having the problem. And if we don't have that enough data, then that runs into the most common issue with Kolbs, which is that the abstraction becomes far too theoretical. We start thinking, I wonder why I'm having this issue. And we're almost just guessing or making estimates. And yes, we're using theory that we've learned maybe on the course or somewhere else, but it relies on the amount of knowledge that we have and the amount of theory that we have. And that's going to be self-limiting because you may not know what the problem is because you haven't learned enough about what the problem is, but you may not learn enough about the problem until you realize where your problem is. It's a self-defeating spiral because you may not have awareness of the characteristic of your problem to know what the problem truly comes from and therefore not know how to really think about it. We get past that by being very observational. We want our reflection to be the data that we use for our abstraction, which is observational. So in our reflection, all we should be doing is really saying, okay, cool. So I tried to sort a thing and it didn't go the way that I wanted. So this experience is perfect. I tried to do it and it didn't go the way that I wanted. We reflect on it and characterize everything that we need to, and we follow the worksheet as best as we can and all of that sort of stuff. When we're going through the abstraction, we should just say, okay, so it looks like when I do, it looks like when I do this, and then when this happens, then I start feeling like this, and then I respond by doing this and this and this. Okay, cool. That's the abstraction that you make. It's an observation. So it looks like, based on this reflection, that I behaved like this when I felt like this, but that only happens when this and this occurs. And then the same thing happens when I feel like this, and that actually happens for a very similar reason. So it looks like whenever this type of thing happens, it makes me feel this way, and I tend to respond by doing this. That is an abstraction, and that's the perfect type of abstraction that we want. When we do it that way, it's purely observational, so therefore it's very unlikely for it to be incorrect. And what we do is then we check that against our theory. Does that abstraction make sense? Based on what I know about cognitive load and studying and learning principles and self-awareness and prioritization and everything that I've learned in the course so far, does that make sense? Yep, it makes sense. Based on what I know, that theory, this is a valid explanation for why I might be having these problems. And now we've done a check. Or we might say, I don't think it quite makes sense. And then we would go back and maybe reflect on it a little bit more, try to deepen that understanding, or maybe we just have to do a few more cycles and collect a little bit more information to really figure out where the root problem is. But if by the end of the reflection, we don't have enough information about where the problem is coming from, then the abstraction, we don't have enough to work with. So we're just making guesses. We're just postulating. We're just speculating. I think it could be this. I believe the problem is this. It's too theoretical. And that means that, sure, in the early stages, our experiments might be correct. However, it's less likely to be correct as time goes on because improvements are more nuanced. It's more subtle. The problems are harder to spot. This is an example where usually like a reflection that's only this long is usually not going to be too great. And another thing that tells us that is that when the abstraction is as long or longer than the reflection, it usually means that the person is too theoretical in the abstraction because they're just trying to figure it out. So they're writing lots, and the reflection is too brief. When the reflection is nice and long, the abstraction is usually a little bit shorter, and the experiment is often very concise. Their experiment is concise and it is specific. However, the process they're using at this stage is not very good. And this particular person did actually improve on it in a really big way. Now let's have a look at their technique as well. So this is what they're producing. So look, it's obviously not linear. There's obviously use of good visuals that are being used here. There's relationships that we're seeing. We're seeing good chunking. So these are all ticking the boxes, right? So you should be thinking about your work. Do you have nonlinear? Do you have visuals? Do you have relationships? Do you have chunking? The important thing, remember here, is we're thinking, do they have a good process where they're using their process of inquiry to create the chunks? Does it seem like the chunks they're creating make sense? Do we have good relationships? And this is something that can be hard for you to self-assess. You may need to get feedback. You may want to submit it to get expert feedback or for live clinics or something like that, just to be sure. And if at any point in the course it's worthwhile doing that, now is the time. Like I said, most important transition. And if we can fix it now, it's going to save us so much time. The way that they have chunked it does seem like it makes sense. It can actually be improved a little bit more. However, we can improve on that even further in Ascent 1. But what I'm really looking for is to see that they are actually asking questions to use it. What I can see here is that they are asking questions. I don't speak this language. However, I can see that they are asking questions about importance. They are broad questions. It does look like they're asking questions about connecting individual concepts together. So these questions, if answered, would tell us about relationships, would tell us about how things fit in the big picture. So have a look at the questions that you're asking and ask yourself, if I were to answer these questions, does it just give me an immediate fact? Does it just help me recall a specific detail? Or just explain a single process or single relationship? Or do these questions help me to think about the big picture? Lots of relationships, lots of different connections between concepts. Does it allow me to see how different things connect together and therefore how I can group and chunk them together? If the answer is yes, and that's how you're using the questions, then by and large, if your Kolb's is good, you're going to be ready to move on, because this is the most important thing, and it's the part that people normally really struggle with. And you can see that based on their work, they're doing really well. I've seen their work since they've submitted this, and it's much, much better as well. They're really on a good track for improvement. Let's have a look at another piece of work here. So here we don't have the questions that they've used. So we don't have enough information to know about whether it's good or not. However, we can look at least just their mind mapping technique. It's non-linear. There's relationships. There is some level of grouping, but it's not super grouped. You can see that it's more just individual ideas connected to other individual ideas. Is that enough to move on to Ascent 1? I'm on the fence. I would rather they start grouping some of these ideas together a little bit more rather than just focusing on individual relationships between individual concepts. And here I'd really like to see the questions they're asking. Are they asking questions that are only looking at individual relationships, or do they ask bigger questions, more open questions that will allow them to see lots of relationships at once and see how they interact and are similar or different to other types of relationships, which allows them to create those chunks. This is one that we can look at just the Kolb's. So straight off the bat, without even reading it, we should notice the reflection is very, very brief. It's very, very short. And this is a problem, right? Remember, when the reflection is too brief, we don't have enough data here. The abstraction ends up being very theoretical. And you can see here the same pattern. We can see the abstraction is much longer than the reflection because they're using the abstraction to just try to think about why it might be happening on their theoretical knowledge. Again, it may work out. It may not work out, and the chances of being wrong get higher and higher the more advanced your technique becomes. In this situation, their reflection is very superficial. They don't often think about what causes them to struggle. They're sort of just saying, I have difficulty, I am struggling, but they're not really saying when they're struggling, what specifically makes them struggle. They're not talking about how they respond to that struggle. They're not talking about what the cognitive process is that induces and makes the struggle worse or better. So we're lacking a lot of the information that we need to figure out how we can do something about their limitations. As a result, this person will find it very difficult and very slow to improve, and they're at risk of being demotivated and more frustrated as time goes on. Here's another Kolb's, and the thing that we should see is reflection is very, very, very short. And if you look at this and if you read it, you will see that the reflection is very superficial as well. Same things. We're talking about, here is a problem I have. But by the time you finish reading this, you don't get a sense for why the problem is happening. We don't get a sense for what the triggers are, what makes it better, what makes it worse. We don't get a sense for how they tend to just really respond to this. It's very overall superficial. And therefore, when we're trying to think, why is this happening? We don't have enough information here, so it makes us overly theoretical, again, making the abstraction very long. And in this case, the experiment that they got is not likely to actually help them in the right direction. So this, at the end of technique training, if your Kolb's is at this level, I would say that is a red flag. We need to work on that before we move on. Now let's have a look at this person's work. They've gone through and put out all of their learning objectives for their subject. They've made a list of all of their keywords. That's great. And then they've asked the questions now. So here we see they're asking really nice, broad, open questions, and it brings us to one of the other really common mistakes that people are making at technique training level, which is that after they ask a really broad, open question, they're then answering it in a very narrow way, linearly underneath it. And this is why in the traffic light system video, at the bottom of that lesson, there is another video clarifying that we should not be answering the question after we ask it in this linear way, because what that does is it takes this nice open question where we can get so many different relationships from that, and then we're closing and shutting all of that down, and we're closing it down to just a single immediate narrow fact or a specific single relationship between maybe just one or two concepts. And what that's going to do is it's going to stop us from being able to chunk and group it together, because we're not seeing how all of these things relate to each other. We're not able to see how different concepts and keywords here are related to each other, how they're similar or different. We're not able to see how they're related, how, maybe something up here might be related to something down here. And because we're closing off those relationships, we're reducing the chances of being able to create meaningful chunks. What happens then is that our mind maps can be very messy and very complicated with lots of relationships being shown everywhere. Or it might be the opposite. There's so many relationships to show that we just give up and then we do something that's very, very simple, not even showing any of it. Or in some cases, because we find it impossible to chunk in a way that makes sense for us, we use the chunking that was just given to us in the textbook or the slides or what our teacher taught us. And as a result, it ends up being something that is very relatively linear. We don't get a lot of relationships between ideas. It just ends up being what we call a waterfall pattern, which is that information only goes downhill. It's just, a heading, subheadings, sub-subheadings, and just bits of detail, but there's no real relationships between the ideas. It's very, very common. So that's the main issue here. Now, they've gone through and actually chunked it, and what we can see is that there's not quite enough chunking here. It's grouped together, but there's just too many things in this group. If we were to ask why each of these individual things is important and how they're related to each other, we would actually find that there is an additional level of chunking that we could have done here, which has been missed in this instance. Now, what this person has done is they've actually gone through and taken another step. So they've gone to the live clinics, they've done some of the spot the issues, and they've heard me talking about this importance-based chunking, and they've actually gone through to try to do it even more. And so they have actually ended up chunking this in a lot more detail. So that's better. However, they're going to find that this process is very time consuming, because they could reach this stage straight after this if they didn't answer this question linearly and they just thought about it in their head, thought about the relationships, thought about how they could group it, and then they offloaded that on non-linear notes. And the other really important reason why we should do this is that it trains your cognitive load tolerance. It's difficult to think about this in your head. It's difficult not to write it down. And that's the point. We need to get used to that so that we can hold on to more information, and it increases our processing ability. Because all the techniques from here on out rely on you having that level of processing ability, which is why it will be a red flag to see something like this. So this is actually the mind map that this person ended up creating. So it's very interesting because we can actually see that there is, good non-linearity. There are relationships between things, but I want you to notice there is essentially no grouping of information at any point after these 3 points here. After this point, All of this is just individual concepts relating to other individual concepts. There's a little bit of grouping that's shown here and here, but it's only the most obvious ones. But over here, it's very, very difficult to follow. And the reason is because those questions showed us lots of relationships, but it didn't allow us to see how all of these things are actually related together in one big chunk, or how this part is related to this thing, which would have made us completely reorder the information in a way that actually might make more sense. We can't see that. It seems impossible because we didn't think about it in that way, because we narrowed in and made it linear. This is an example of how we might have lots of relationships, but we still might forget most of this. Our retention might be low. It may feel overwhelming because we didn't chunk it enough. And that's going to be the main thing for this person. And that's the thing that they would need to work on. So I would say that if you're in this situation, this is an example where every other part of the technique is absolutely perfect, but because we're narrowing in, we're not getting enough chunking. So we would need to focus on that first before moving on to the next stage. Otherwise, we're going to find it's a little bit difficult. Now, this is a piece of work that was actually submitted by the exact same person. You can see, again, as you would expect, they had the same transferable error in their technique. So we would predict that even though this is a completely different topic, this is probability, a mathematics topic, not biology, which it was before, we would still see that there's not enough chunking and there's lots of individual relationships, but it's hard to overall keep track of it. It's not well grouped, but the other technique we would expect to be pretty good. And indeed, we can actually see that. We can see that there's lots of individual relationships, but there's not too much grouping outside of the immediate, most obvious ones here. This is something for this person to work on before moving to the next stage. So have a look at your notes at this point and have a look, see, are you making these really common mistakes? And if so, we want to work on these and fix these before we move on. Here's another set of notes where they're asking these questions. And again, what do we see? Linear notes underneath it. I mean, this person, and I can tell you because I have domain-specific knowledge about what they're studying, the amount of detail they're going into, I mean, look, there's a lot of text here. The amount of depth they're going into is incredibly superficial. The amount they need to write to properly show the relationships and the true conceptual depth of this, to get the level of mastery of knowledge that they're probably looking for, it would be triple, if not pentuple, what they've written. So again, this is just that disadvantage of having linear notes. So all of the relationships they can find through big open questions is being narrowed down. However, what we're also seeing is that the questions are a little narrow as well. We've got questions that are only going to be retrieving on immediate facts and individual concepts. The questions, if we were to answer them, don't really show us relationships between lots of different concepts. This is really a more open question. Just how effective is it? So there's more relationships that we might be able to create there. And you can actually see that the answer they've posted is a lot longer. But funnily enough, again, this is very, very superficial relative to how deep we could go in. And it's probably going to take 10 times longer to actually try to represent that through linear notes as well. This person hasn't even sent through something non-linear. I'm not even sure if they were using any non-linear technique. This is something that really should have been stopped all the way in fundamentals. If you're writing notes that are like this, that's a big red flag. We need to really slow down, go back, get used to our non-linear note taking, and start representing things a little bit more relationally and changing our questions up so that it looks more at those relationships. Here is another one. This person is using the collecting and processing step, but we can see that their processing skill is pretty good. It's looking pretty neat. So I would say that this person can completely abandon the collecting. They don't need to have that 2-column layout anymore. It's probably just holding them back even more. They could just go straight to taking information in and processing it out in a mind map type thing. Let's zoom in a little bit to see the quality of the questions they're asking. Here we can see that, sorry, not the questions, what they're collecting. You know, they're just collecting that information. You know, it's pretty much impossible to do that wrong. Here they are showing some very basic grouping of information. There's a little bit of relationships that are being shown here. However, we don't see the questions they're using to get to that point. It's a little bit hard to evaluate. They may have been just using the textbook questions that they got, but that's not a good step because it's not training our ability to use questions of our own volition. So for this person, I would really want to see them take those questions, and I want to see how they're able to create a big flow of information through process notes by asking those questions. I want to see them create those relationships by themselves, and I wouldn't be happy for them to move to Ascent 1 with just what they've shown me yet. Okay, and what do we think about this one? So this is another example of someone sending me through their notes. Hopefully we can see straight away the questions that are being asked. They're very, very straightforward. You can see that it's only going to be recalling isolated information. Virtually none of the information here is actually testing on relationships. We have only a few that are very, very scattered in between, but almost everything is just immediate fact recall. The questions are answered linearly underneath this. Really here, there's a lot of improvement necessary. If this person moves on to Ascent 1 or Ascent 2, it's going to be catastrophic. So this person needs to definitely stop, go back, and look at the fundamentals again. Make sure that we're asking more open questions, thinking more about the relationships, and trying to group that information together and show those relationships. And finally, here's an example of someone who, again, we don't have the questions that they've used, unfortunately, but what we can see from their notes is that there's some grouping of information. They've even made them larger in text. So they've thought about how different things fit together, how they're related together. We can see relationships forming here, and there's definitely areas that we can have improvement, but overall, it's grouped, it's non-linear, it's not too wordy, all the fundamental things. And on top of that, we have some chunking that's being shown. I can tell through my domain knowledge of this that the way that they've chunked it does seem like they've used a process of inquiry to see how it's related. So I'd say at this point, the next improvement is to increase the quality of their chunks and increase the quality of their relationships through increasing the quality of their questions. And that's a sign that they're ready to move on to Ascent 1. But hopefully we can see that it's not possible to increase the quality of chunking, the quality of relationships, and the quality of questions if the questions don't lead to relationships and the relationships don't lead to chunks. So that's why we need to have that first. We need to get into the habit of using questions to find relationships, and those relationships find us chunks, and we can represent those chunks non-linearly through good non-linear relational note-taking. And if we can't do that, even if we improve the quality of the questions, because the question quality is not directly translating into better relationships and better chunks and better note-taking, that would fail. And so they'd be left in a very weird place where their questions are fine, but every other part of their technique is holding them back. Again, that would be a big red flag. We need to make sure that we've got that clear chain. Questions lead to relationships, relationships lead to chunks, and those chunks are represented very cleanly, and we're able to do a good quality Kolb's on all of that. Have a look at your Kolb's if you're doing it, and if you're not doing it, just that's a red flag in itself. Have a look at your Kolb's, look at the accuracy of it. Have a look at your notes, have a look at your questions and the way you're going about asking those questions and the cognitive process, what's going on in your head when you're answering the questions. Are you answering them in a way that allows you to show and express relationships, and then using those relationships to find chunks and showing all of that on your nonlinear notes? And if you're at that point, then you'll be ready to move on. And again, like I said before, the non-academic skills, that's something that you can work on as you feel the need to over time. If you've met those checkpoints, good work, carry on through. If you're unsure, reach out, get some feedback, live clinics, expert feedback submissions, whatever it is that you choose to do to get the level of certainty. It's well worth the time at this point. And at this stage of your technique development to get this sorted before moving on. Like I said, it is a critical transition point, and it's that real perspective shift of seeing it not in terms of information priority, but relational priority, and that is a big shift. When you see things differently and when you start seeing it in that way, you will know that it's different. You realize that you're starting to see information differently. You can feel there's a difference in how you're starting to think about learning and information. And you should feel that things are starting to click together. And if you don't feel that yet, that's a pretty good sign that there's something going on. If you're not sure about it, that's a good reason why you should reach out for feedback. If you realize that there's something that's holding you back and you need to work on it, fantastic. Really, really good for being able to self-assess that and realize where the limitations are. Go work on that, come back, check up again, and then when you're ready to move on, you're ready to move on.